Tom, let's talk about some of the technology. Obviously, 16, 18 months old, constantly maturing, constantly innovating. What are some of the most recent updates and what else is coming out shortly?
Yeah, sure. So I was looking at this, there's a massive amount and there's too much to talk about. But I'll just mention a few things, looking back maybe 6 months, and then also looking at the roadmap in two phases. Things that are in preview today, which customers can go and sign up for, and previews that will be starting shortly for new roadmap items. But let's just start by looking back. The first thing is WVD Gateways. So these are Azure geographies that host the WVD Gateway component, which is the service that connects users from wherever they are on the globe through to their virtual machine in Azure, in whichever region they've placed it. So obviously, the more of those there are, and the more that are closer to you as a user, the better, because that will reduce latency. Okay. So we've had, I don't know, 20 odd of these. And then back in September, we released new ones in Germany and South Africa. And then in October, we rolled them out to Switzerland and Canada. So those geographies have better connectivity. One of the most asked for, probably the second most asked for capability, is support for Microsoft Endpoint Manager, or MEM. Now, there's actually a large piece of work, and we'll come on to that at the end when we talk about the preview features. But back in September, we announced support for hybrid Azure Active Directory domain join for Windows 10 Enterprise. So this is a single session version. So customers can use MEM as a single pane of glass for the management of a part of WVD, the single session. Yeah. There's been just a never-ending list of updates that have gone into the Azure Portal specifically. Too many to mention. Some that might be worth mentioning is we've just eased the whole user experience in terms of deployment and sped that process up. One of the capabilities is that we now surface up the local account that gets created on the VMs should there only be a failure joining it to the domain. Now, a small capability, but we didn't actually articulate that to customers, so they weren't aware of actually what was happening. So now they get the capability of saying, this is the account I want created, rather than us taking what was their domain join account and creating a local account based on that. We've also enabled far more information to be surfaced up in the portal back to customers. So one of the things, we display the version of the WVD agent in the portal for their session hosts. We have enabled bulk operations, so you can bulk delete, bulk change the drain mode on these session hosts rather than doing it individually. And one of the features that got a lot of feedback, surprisingly, was the support for dark mode in the portal. There was a small bug that wasn't displaying the text correctly. So you changed the dark mode and the text was still dark, so you couldn't really see it. That got a whole load of feedback. So it's interesting what customers think or feel is important and the response that we put into that. Those updates will continue going forward. Back in November, we updated support for PowerShell. So there's now version 2 of the WVD commandlets that supports, or will bring support for MSI App Attach, which is a preview feature we'll mention in a minute. Obviously, most people are aware we acquired FSLogics. It'll be close to Michelle's heart. That product continues to get updates. So there was a major September update, and then in January there was a hotfix for that set of updates. So point here is FSLogics as a product is still getting massive updates as we go forward. Good. One of the other features was RBAC, so role-based access control. If you go to the Azure Portal, you've effectively got access to an entire data center. If you're doing this on premises, obviously IT doesn't give everybody access to the entire data center and everything within it. RBAC is the mechanism for providing specific sets of permissions to different teams. We support that in WVD, but have added a whole set of additional capabilities so that you can distribute the permissions inside of a WVD deployment. So different people can do different things. Makes sense. It's not just technology. We've also last month introduced a 30% discount for 2 types of VMs that are deployed inside of WVD. That has to be enabled before the end of March. So it's just about assisting companies out there to adopt, I suppose, quicker. Interesting. So those are just some of the preview features that were released over the last few months, going back to November, starting with a product we called RDP Short Path Private. Now, what this does is it brings 2 things. It's effectively the utilization of a managed network, which is either express route, private dedicated connection into Azure, or a VPN from a customer's location into their Azure subscription. Now, what this means is that the RDP traffic connecting through to the VMs is now off of the internet. And it also means it bypasses our control plane. And what that means is that there's reduced number of network hops that are required to get to the session hosts. It also introduces the UDP protocol, and perhaps more specifically, a new protocol called URCP that Microsoft Research Labs created some time back, obviously based upon UDP. Now, this is obviously a much more efficient protocol than TCP. Now, the net result is the combination of those two things produces much improved user experience by virtue of reduced latency to those virtual machines. So that should be going GA in the coming months. And then December was a bumper month for preview features. So one of those was a thing called Azure Monitor for WVD, also known as Insights inside of the portal. Now, this is a Microsoft pre-built Azure Monitor workbook that displays what we think are the top metrics that a typical WVD admin would want surfaced up to them.
Oh, okay.
And it's fully automated. So you would just basically go and click a button and we will go and configure all of the diagnostic settings for the WVD objects and push out the monitoring agent to the session hosts, and then automate the collection of the metrics for those VMs, event logs. And then we also will automatically present the visualizations of that data back into some nice sort of graphs. So it's a nice feature. You don't really have to do anything bar enabling it and pushing out this config via a single button, but you can then modify it yourself. So if you wanted to stop collecting certain metrics and add additional ones, or present the data in a different way, you can absolutely do that inside of Azure Monitor.
Perfect.
One of the other features that got a lot of interest and continues to is this thing called MSIX App Attach. Mm-hmm. We refer to it as the future of dynamic application delivery. Now, this is actually a combination of two things coming together. So MSIX, unrelated to WVD, predates WVD, is our new application packaging format that will eventually, over time, effectively replace everything that goes before it, such as MSI, AppV, and all those others. Now, it's not a like-for-like replacement, in particular for AppV, but it will, like I said, over time, replace that capability. So that's MSIX. The App Attach is a WVD specific component, only available in WVD, and it's the attaching of MSIX applications that are stored effectively on a VHD or a SIMFS file, and those get attached or mounted onto the session host, and then the applications within those VHDs are then registered with the operating system when the user signs in, enabling them to just go and launch an app as if it was installed locally, even when obviously it isn't. Now, the benefit here is that an organization can have a single golden image and then distribute that and treat those VMs like sort of cattle class. We don't really care too much about them because they're not specific. They're not siloed for a set of users or a set of applications. They're effectively identical. You know, if there's a problem with one, basically you just replace it. And you bring in these applications dynamically to the users at the point that they need it. So it's kind of a game changer, we think, or it will be in the future for, you know, how you deliver applications, which is effectively what we're all here to do. You know, WVD, Citrix, VMware, it's all been about how to get users productive with the applications that they need. And in the past, it's been difficult to do that. And you've ended up with hundreds of silos for you know, various reasons. That now we have the opportunity now of moving away from that model and dynamically delivering these applications.
Yeah. So just to be clear on that, unlike AppV, the applications are not virtualized and self-contained.
They're not virtualized. They are self-contained. So they effectively run in a container, not to be confused with Kubernetes and all that kind of stuff, but an application container, an MSIX container.
Can they talk to each other?
They can, yes. Yeah.
Okay. And then does each application have its own layer, if I can use that, or can you put multiple applications into a layer that you then attach?
You can, yes. So they can contain one application if that's what you want to do, or they can contain multiples. So there's a process that's called expansion. So you take this application that's in a MSIX format and expand it into a VHD or a SIMFS. Now, if you do that multiple times for different applications, they will exist in the same VHD if that's the format that you're using. And then when you go and publish that to users inside of the Azure portal, our process will understand that there's multiple apps in there and allow you to publish one or all of them if you want to different users. So talking actually about Zoom is a good segue. It's not just Microsoft that have been, enabling new capabilities around this capabilities. So Zoom, if we go back a step, actually, you're probably aware that Microsoft have enabled Teams media optimization. So this is the ability to redirect Teams calls down to the local devices who establish the voice and video call, and then it's presented back up into the session. So Zoom have done effectively exactly the same thing for their client. So Zoom will now work in an optimized manner inside of a WVD. In fact, in the VDI type use case, all that. End computing, now they also made an announcement around their devices supporting WVD natively. And I think that you guys over at IGEL have a close sort of relationship and collaboration with them. And I think their devices support IGEL OS as well. So lots of sort of collaboration going on there. There are a few sort of what's coming and upcoming previews. So everything I've mentioned there will be going GA over the coming months. But there's some new features and previews that will be starting soon. Going back to the gateways, if you live in the United Arab Emirates, they will be getting some gateways in the near future. Another thing that's particularly relevant to European customers, and for that matter, UK customers, is our metadata service. Now, this is where we store the information that defines your configuration. So if you go and deploy WVD, there's some information about these VMs are in this host pool, for example. That's all stored in some databases that currently are located in a number of Azure regions in the US. Now, that has been a problem for some, particularly European customers who stipulate that it has to be in the EU or it just can't be in the US. So what we've announced is that the EU, specifically North Europe and West Europe, will get this metadata service in March. So customers will then be, when they go and deploy WVD, they'll see these options to say West Europe, and they can go and deploy the metadata in there. The UK, Australia, and Canada will be coming in June. Another service is this thing we call Start VM on Connect. Now, what this does is it enables the end user to have the power to power on their VM just at the right time that they need it. Okay, so without this, IT has to predict when they think the user will start, and then it might start the VM 30 minutes beforehand. But that's 30 minutes of cost of that VM running that they have to pay for, and it's not in use. What happens if that user is having a half day or is not in that day? That's more time that VM's powered on. The reverse is also true. If they start early and the VM's not powered on, then they're going to be unproductive. So the client, the WVD client, will now power on a deallocated Azure VM when they click on the icon. So the icon will just display that the VM is starting, and then we'll connect them to it once it's powered on. So maximize the cost savings by having these VMs powered off for as much of the time as possible. We mentioned Teams optimizations. That's coming for Mac OS. So there's lots of organizations out there that do have a MacBook deployment, and those users want to maybe also use WVD and also want to use Teams inside of that WVD session. So we would just say to Mac users out there, keep their eyes on App Central for a new updated Mac OS client, hopefully in the next couple of months, that will support those media optimizations. And then the final two previews that will be starting soon are the top two things that are asked for from our customers. The second most is going back to the MEM conversation, so the Microsoft Endpoint Manager. We will be shortly starting a preview for the support of Windows 10 multi-session, which is really the hero capability inside of WVD. To have that supported inside of the Microsoft Endpoint Manager console. So a single pane of glass for the management of both physical devices, all of the other OSs that are supported, but now also Windows 10 multi-session. So you could do all your end-to-end administration policies and all of that kind of stuff. There will also be a new, very easy policy authoring capability that will enable you to just go and filter on, for example, Windows 10 multi-session and find policies that are only relevant to Windows 10, and then have the ability to publish that policy to WVD session hosts, which are importantly based upon their Azure AD group membership. And that takes us to the final one, which is the number one thing that customers ask for, which is Azure Active Directory domain join for WVD session hosts, in particular Windows 10 multi-session. That's also known simply as Azure AD only. So what this will do is provide the capability of having the Windows 10 multi-session VM only joined to Azure Active Directory. What that will enable, optionally, is that customers do not need to have Active Directory available at all for their WVD deployment. It's optional because there will be customers that still require AD, but if you didn't need or didn't require AD, then you can get rid of that infrastructure. So what this will provide then is true modern authentication to Azure AD, and also single sign-on to the session hosts themselves. So, one account to get you into the session, as well as into Office apps, as well as into any other SaaS-based app, which is secured behind Azure AD. It will also, at a much later date, introduce things like Azure AD B2B, which is the capability of one organization inviting other users into their directory to then present them services that the first organization operates. WVD will become one of those. Now, that will become much, much later in this roadmap. And these capabilities themselves actually are arriving in a number of phases over the next sort of 1 to 2 years. So this capability will start appearing, not all in one chunk, but appearing over time. So hopefully that will address the vast majority of our user sort of requests in this space.
Perfect. Tom, absolutely fantastic. Extremely, lots and lots of going on there. Obviously a big focus on collaboration, things like Teams and Zoom, very important. Obviously, lots of conversations I'm having at the moment are all around, is modern management a alternative solution to desktop as a service? And I think what's starting to happen is that we're starting to see that actually these two things need to coexist almost. And then probably quite a nice link to where we want to finish up today, coming back to Michelle, is lots going on around just how you can continue to reduce the cost, right? The ability to automatically start a VM. Michelle, let's come back to you, because I know you wanted to sort of finish up today on how you've seen the overall cost of WVD is actually starting to fall.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think Tom already mentioned it as in part of the roadmap. You'll hear he talked about the App Attach, which is, from a business perspective, it's a way to lower the cost of management of your WVD platform, and those are great things. What we sometimes see with customers is that those are soft costs, so customers have a harder time using this in their business case, although they should. But I think one of the other interesting things that are not very well known, but our most successful customers, they do know it, is that in the beginning I focused on unique benefits that our customers utilize of WVD in order to lower costs. But that's mostly like in the beginning. So they have a status where they are today. It's usually on-prem, and then they make a business case to go to WVD. That's one very important step, and if WVD has unique characteristics to make that business case work. But the real power is to adopt a mindset of continuous optimization. And the great thing about WVD is that there's actually some very good examples of this continuous optimization benefiting the customer from the business side, which effectively means that when you use WVD, if you adopt this mindset of continuous optimization, the cost will go down, right? So the longer you use WVD, the cheaper it gets. And in many cases, the performance gets better too. And if you compare that to what people used to do, or many people still are doing, is building on-premises environment and renewing it every 3 to 5 years, that's the game changer. Because, in itself, I think that if you were to build a new virtual desktop deployment today, it's almost impossible to do it cheaper on-prem, but that's only from the initial acquisition, cost. But when you build something on-prem, you set it and forget it, and there's no way to optimize. Even if you were to be able to do something special that requires you, or that gives you the ability to have, 5% or 10% more users on the same virtual machine, it doesn't matter because you've already paid for the asset, right? There's no monetary gain in it for you. Whereas with WVD, there is, because you only pay for what you use. So if you have optimizations, or if you have new capabilities that give you higher density or some other types of cost savings, it immediately impacts your bottom line. And just to make that a little bit more tangible, is there are some examples that, and this is, most of it, interestingly enough, isn't per se a WVD thing. So it's not a WVD feature that we release that suddenly reduces costs. Sometimes it happens, but the examples I have here are because of Azure, because of the cloud. So for example, what's happened already a few times is that a new VM type would become available. So when WVD launched, you had, for example, the D series and the V3 version of that. And then, a few months ago, we released the V4 version, which sounds like a small thing, but the V4 version is a little bit faster than the predecessor, but it's also a little bit cheaper. So we're not talking 20%, but maybe 5% or something like that. But the point is that you can use that benefit, right? You can change your VM types in a second, and then you can do it that way. Or maybe there's a completely new VM type with a GPU, for example, that gives you higher density. You can use it, right, and lower your cost. Or we've had customers change the local storage option in their virtual machine. Technically speaking, this is something called an ephemeral disk. And that's a special disk type in Azure that doesn't fit a whole lot of scenarios, but for WVD, it's a very interesting fit. And it completely takes the cost of local storage away. There are examples where Microsoft introduces price cuts for storage. So if you followed Azure file storage, the performance has gone up by increased IOPS and multi-channel, but the cost has gone down. We've reduced cost by 33%. So that is what, from minute one, that's the cost reduction, right? And these are just some examples of what happened, I think, in the last 6 months. So my point is that if you adopt this mindset of continuous optimization, so don't do what you did on-prem, build it and never look back. That would be selling yourself short. But if you adopt this mindset, then there will be additional cost savings, optimizations, and possibilities. I don't know which ones, but there will be ones. And I think it's super important to remember that that's unique to WVD because it's a cloud service. So it's not a great solution to start with, but it's better over time. And I think that's something that's key to know about.
No, good. Thank you, Michel. I think it is quite easy, particularly for those of us that have been in this space for some time. It's quite easy for us to try and, compare apples with apples all the time and look at the initial outlay and the CapEx cost. And to your point, Tom's gone through some features which quite obviously can help reduce the cost of how much Azure that you're actually using. But to your point, there's a whole other part of Microsoft that is constantly tweaking and changing the cost of those. And by the sounds of things, those costs continue to not just come down, but also features and functionality tends to improve. Guys, that was a completely awesome session, very comprehensive, a massive amount of detail. Great to hear customer stories around transformation. Great to hear such a comprehensive roadmap, and great to hear that you guys and the WVD business is still going well, and most importantly, providing solutions for organisations that are undoubtedly particularly keeping them afloat at this time. So, thank you very much for all of your time this morning. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, I should say, and. Yeah, I hope that I can come and see you very, very soon. Thanks again.
No problem. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Simon. Bye-bye.
Cheers.